Thank you, Mr. Mark. As all of you are aware that NTPC being a market leader in thermal generation, we have 26% share in thermal in India. Similar, so once the government of India decided that we wanted to do 175 gigawatt by adding renewable, so we have also tried to align ourselves with the government of India target. We have already given 10,000 megawatt RE commitment to the government of India, which will be setting up. And another 15,000 megawatt is being implemented by us through a developer mode, where the different developers will be setting up. And this is a project which is being on behalf of MNRE. As far as the 10,000 megawatts are concerned, we have already commissioned approximately 1,000 megawatt. And in this year, in this financial year 17-18, we have already floated tenders worth 1,500 megawatt. And 2,500 megawatt tenders are again being floated by end of this financial year. And the rest, 5,000 megawatt, will be in next 2 years will be floating. We are already identifying land because, you know, the RE projects needs, as well as the solar is concerned, we need large chunks of lands which are being basically identified, allotted in the different states. So this 10,000 megawatt will be setting our own projects. Apart from them, we have done already 3,000 megawatt in the first tranche, which Government of India, through the Ministry of New and Renewable Energy, have already given us a responsibility of selecting a developer for setting up large utility solar projects. Our 3,000 we have already tied up. Out of that, 1,500 megawatt is already commissioned. Rest of things are under various stages of construction. And we have also going to take up the next tranche, which is 5,000 megawatt. And the third tranche will be 7,000. Those will be taking up shortly. But as far as NTPC is concerned, we have already drawn a corporate plan of 132 gigawatt of by 2032. We are today 51,000 plus company. And in this 132, we have already identified 32 gigawatt we will be adding by 2032. So we have already strategized ourselves, aligning the government of India, because the renewal is the future, and we have been will be adding in next few years, and year after year we are doing much and much improvement in all these things. That's all.
Thank you very, very much, Mr. Reyna. Obviously, NTPC is at the cutting edge of working on all fronts to accommodate large-scale integration of the renewable energy resource as it comes online, and being flexible enough to adapt and understand how that can be most fruitfully used. I mean, kudos to your organization, but also good planning and foresight for what the future is going to bring. I know earlier on in the day we heard from one of our German colleagues about the need to back down one of its coal-fired plants to about 5% of capacity due to the market demand for energy and the accommodation of renewables into the system. This is, of course, remarkable. I mean, backing down thermal energy or coal-fired power energy to 5% of capacity is pretty incredible. But it does point to the importance of market drivers and indicators, and as long as we continue to be receptive to that and make sure that the market is functioning and efficient, and as India begins to develop, I think its market place for energy, including the integration of renewables, then we're going to see that marketplace be the indicator, be the leading edge of decision making and policy making. Let me turn now to our second participant, our panel member, Jacqueline. Again, Dr. Cochran, you've been associated with the power sector here in India for quite some time now. Can you give us a little feel about your thoughts on some of the latest trends in the U.S. that could be useful learning for India to integrate this large amount of VRE into the grid? Your experiences, what you see happening in the U.S., and how India might take advantage of that.
Sure. I guess one of the trends that we see in the U.S. is increasing use of market signals for both short-term and long-term decision-making. So short-term investments, so that's where you see the market signals play a role in who is incentivized, for example, to provide flexibility when you need it. And that can be essential for sort of the broader system integration where we're thinking about storage or demand response and electric vehicles and other types of things. And then the long term, of course, too, because we want to make sure that the generation that we need in the future is incentivized to stay online or to retire or to come up. I think a second trend would be to treat renewable energy as a regular power plant. So we want renewable energy to be a good grid citizen and contribute to the reliability of the grid. And so you're increasingly seeing expectations of renewable energy to be, to bid into markets, to provide the ancillary services that we need on the system. And let's see, maybe a third trend would be moving away from planning concepts like baseload to thinking about the system a little bit more holistically, a little bit like Simon was describing at the end, just thinking, stepping back and rethinking how we want to think about the power system. So that is not to mean that we don't need generation that's available most of the time, like what we think of as a baseload plant. But baseload can hinder us if we're thinking about it as, well, we need 70% baseload, 30% mid-merit, and 10% peak. So again, moving away from thinking about that kind of term towards more comprehensive planning where you're looking at renewable energy and the other resources on the system and seeing, well, which ones are the least cost, in terms of capacity expansion, what's the least cost in terms of operating, and then, what is it that we need from all the characteristics to make a reliable system? I'll stop there.
Thanks, Dr. Cochran. You touched on a number of things there that I find pretty poignant. Certainly the one, readjusting our expectations of the renewable energy framework, including the market aspect as well as the technical point, but moving away from current planning concepts. I think that's one that often gets some folks who are on the cutting edge, such as yourself and our other distinguished panel members, excited because there's more work to be done. But at the same time, it makes probably systems operators a little bit nervous. One, because they've entrenched in their own tradition, and they certainly have carved out an incredible expertise. And now to think that they've got to retool can sometimes be challenging. Are there challenges that we see there in that sector or in that subsector? Or do you see people really receptive to that?
It's a political discussion in the United States, at least. So I wouldn't say it's fully receptive, but but that's the trend in power system planning.
Thank you. Thank you. My good friend Marcus, I wanted to ask you a little bit about some of the key learnings from the German power sector, sort of paralleling what Jacqueline Cochran just shared with us, that you think would be useful takeaways for India.
Yeah, thanks, Michael. As we have seen also in the presentations during the day, Germany made tremendous progress, and right now we have about 31% electricity generated by renewables. In the presentation from Simon, he showed Germany in phase 3 of this expansion. The lessons learned so far is, and I think actually we really spend a lot of money. But we paid also with this the learning curve for many others, I think. And now our prices have come down tremendously everywhere. There's one big issue, and that's of course related to grid and grid integration. The grid cannot follow the expansion of the renewables at the same pace. It needs much more time to construct transmission lines. And it's not only that we have here technical issues. We also have non-technical issues which are related to political reasons. There is resistance in the population also. People just don't want to see all these transmission lines in their backyard. They also don't want to see all these asparagus windmills in their backyards, despite the fact that they love climate change. And I mean, they don't love climate change, but they love combating climate change, etc. So it needs a lot of political discussion and convincing also. And that's a little bit also what I feel is lacking in India so far. Maybe it's not that important yet when you are in phase 2, but when you want to go to phase 3, being still in Simon's presentation, and then going even from phase 3 to phase 4, which is a complete transformation of your system, and where you then aim for renewables of 80% or so, then probably we will see and face much more resistance from the population. It starts with the things that people can block your construction of transmission lines by court cases for whatever reasons, because I don't want to get too specific, but they can just do it. We are a democratic country. We have a free possibility of everyone to go to the courts, and then they can delay it for years and years and years. Same thing here in India as well. People also who don't benefit from the renewables because they simply don't have land what they own, which they can sell to or rent out to wind developers, etc. They might start to envy the guy enriching himself with renewables, and then they also start not to support it and rather to put a barrier. Same thing is with the others who are losing out from this, like the thermal plant operators are, yes, they make money with more flexibility, and I think that's also a great learning we had in Germany, that things are doable, even like 5%, and as we have seen from Jacqueline's presentation, 55% of PLF for India might do, or for quite some time. But yeah, things are doable, but yes, they are doable if someone pays for it. So nothing comes for free, and you have to compensate those thermal plant operators, otherwise they will shut down the plant because it's no longer viable. What I want to say is there are people also who are not benefiting, and we have to see how we get them also on board. And it needs much more in political engagement, discussions, etc., to have support for this Energiewende. And you have seen it also in the presentations. Presently, Germany is a bit slowing down with the expansion of the renewables. And precisely here, it needs more political discussion, more support, and yeah, we may also have to take that time. We should not expect everything to happen immediately. If it takes a year more or 2 years more to convince people and also to listen to everyone and take everyone into consideration, it's actually a good thing. But just to quote our ambassador from this morning, I feel the renewables in Germany, the Energiewende, is unstoppable, and it will happen, and it is happening.
Marcus, thank you very much. You touched on a lot there, and I was thinking I'd go back and give a synopsis, but now I realize that the three things that I noticed that you touched on that are so relevant are the ones that affect so many different sectors, but in fact, in the energy sector, we see it so much more prevalent. The resistance in the population, or as you might refer to it as the social will to adopt this, I often make the comparison in the development sector how this is different than many other things that we try to introduce in terms of behavior change. It's not the same as convincing mothers that nutritious food for your family is good, or that farmers to adopt new seeds might be more productivity. But this is something that's difficult for the general population to see and understand and touch, because power, of course, is something that happens at the point of a switch on the wall for 98% of the population. But that and the economic changes, not only the financial changes up front, but the economic wins and losses to be had in the aftermath are something that population has a difficult time understanding. And so there needs to be a lot of socialization of this. And of course, that all comes from, as you mentioned, the political will and leadership. And we are seeing it in places like Germany, bit by bit, and we'll continue to see that, hopefully. And for every step forward, there's a step back. As you notice, we're slowing down, but hopefully those steps forward continue. Thank you for your remarks and your comments. I know that we are to our esteemed colleague, Mr. Suni, and I'd like to just, we've heard some of the American perspective, and we've heard some of the German perspective, and we've heard a little bit from a couple others, but now I'd like Mr. Suni to turn to you and ask, based on these international perspectives, to the extent that is relevant, what would be the relevant learnings that could be adopted for India? How ready is India to look at these things seriously and adopt them into their own protocols? Or On the other side of that coin, if you see other areas that haven't been touched on, can you share with us some of your perspectives on the pathways you believe India needs to take to get there? Thank you.
Thank you. Very loaded question. And which way to start is a question. So let me pick up threads from my left and from my right. Jacqueline said that renewable should behave like citizens, and you stop there. I would say we have learned from others that renewables from child, it has crossed adolescence and has now become adult. So throw the kid's glove out. It should give everything what a conventional power plant gives, something more. Because it is digital, it can give us fast response, it can give inertia, it can give droop characteristics, again, something more. So that should be the demand which I learned that we should pick up very quickly and start advocating that. That's one. Marcus talked about transmission, NIMBY and NOPE and all such things. So run. Build transmission wherever you can. Don't think about it. If you can, overbuild transmission. And I say that very boldly. It will be a least regret decision for the country. And we have seen, if you look at the history of all the countries where then the transmission was. So we have now a dozen HVDCs, 765 kV, hundreds of lines, rings after rings are being built very silently. It will help renewable also. So these are the two lessons which certainly we are trying to do. Now, other lessons, every time we attend such conferences, we have some lessons. We don't always explicitly say, but we quietly take it back. That technical minimum is also derived from the market. Very difficult to digest for a technical person like me, but that's a reality. That's a fact. And very rightly asked the question, how this 55% came. So our market products have to go up. And there are market believers, non-believers, it's there everywhere. So we need to push that. How do we bring in new products in the market and ramp up the market issues? So that's another one which we realize. The other one is, everybody is talking about, I was counting, then I lost count of it, how many times the word flexibility was used. Every speaker has talked about flexibility. Every presentation has about flexibility. There must be something in it. So we, so now the question is, make everybody flexible, whether it is needed or not needed, since everybody is talking about it. So we have made our thermal flexible, 55, we'll try to bring it down. I assure you, we will argue that why 55, why not below. Our hydro flexibility. We have recently come out with a report. We have understood that our hydro is also not very flexible. Even if it was flexible, it can become a little more flexible. Coming to transmission, we are saying that transmission also should become flexible, bring in more controls in it, like HVDC or other things. And then, of course, we are not sparing ourselves also. The system operators also has to become flexible. Market also has to become flexible. The regulator should become more flexible. So I have understood that policies also must become flexible. So that's one word which I have sprinkled anywhere and everywhere indiscriminately. And it has worked. It is not found anywhere unfit. So I think I stop here. Lightly, but we have realized rigidity does not pay. And it is told to me by my instructor early in the morning in yoga that your this hand is still not flexible. Make it more flexible. So, I mean, for a healthy life, flexibility is the key. I have understood very well. So.
I knew there was a reason I'd forgot to introduce you at the beginning, Mr. Suni, and now I remember. You have brought to the discussion, of course, a little bit of levity, but a little bit of reality. It reminds me, of course, my mother who always said moderation. And so they're parallel words, I think, in some ways in this particular sense. Moderation makes for a better life, and flexibility in our sector, of course, makes for probably better policy, better implementation, and better management. And what's really great to hear, of course, as always has been the case as long as we've worked together, is the sense of passion and commitment to this that you have, but your sense of realism. And so we take your words to be not only definitive, but also as a suggestion for the future as we all work together on this. Thank you very much for sharing that with us. I'd like to turn to our last, but certainly not least, final member of our distinguished panel, Mr. Hoffman.
Simon.
Our last two.
We are flexible.
I'm being flexible, yeah. I guess I skipped over one, okay. Anyways, let me turn to our second to the last member of our distinguished panel. As I mentioned earlier, distinguished in his own sense. But Simon, let me ask you, based on the international perspective, your experience, what would be your most relevant learning experiences that you could bring to, that you would, if you were the leader of the universe, you would bring here to this session and to the Indian government and to the open market here and to the population? What would you tell us are the things that you've learned that are applicable here in India?
Well, thank you very much. Maybe I won't start on that premise, and it's a little bit hard to come after such a great intervention. I think we've already mentioned very many elements of a strategy and so forth throughout the day. So I won't go into these detailed elements. Let me just be brief on 3 points where I'd say, okay, these are some very high-level principles that I've seen by experiencing this discussion situation in a large number of countries. The first thing that I would say is to separate the technical and the political issues. And both of them are relevant. But system integration frequently risks to fall into the trap that political things are phrased in a technical manner. I'll give you an example. If you ask an existing generator, what is your technical capability to become flexible? You are asking, what is your technical flexibility to reduce your market share? And it is quite natural that the first response will be very little, right? Because who wants to lose market share? Now, so there we have the mix-up between the political issue, which is about, how do we compensate people who might be on the losing end of a certain transition, versus the technical component. And then one needs to think about what kind of mechanism is appropriate, who has a right to certain revenues or doesn't have a right to revenues. I think one role of the market in Europe has simply been to signal the market exit of certain capacity, and doing so on the basis of an economic signal rather than a political decision. Second point is to be ambitious, but to always safeguard reliability. So I'll take 2 examples, Ireland and Australia. Ireland put a moratorium on its wind development in the early 2000s after the system operator wrote a letter to the Prime Minister and said, this is becoming too risky. We need to go back and see what's happening here. Ireland did a set of systematic studies and has since then really implemented a coordinated strategy to get to a very ambitious renewable energy target. But they had a point where they said, okay, let's review this, and the system operator has the right and the capabilities to curtail wind when it's needed for security of supply. Conversely, in Australia, there was a perception that things would sort out itself, leading to a very high concentration of wind in a certain part of the country, in the state of South Australia, and operating practices where in hindsight one might say, maybe we should have been more cautious on this side regarding some protocols. So really to strike this balance. Third and final point, and that is a direct recommendation. I think it's very hard to do system integration of renewables without an accurate signal of the value of electricity in time and place. Because the principal impact you get from more variable supply is that the volatility of value of electricity goes up. And you need some kind of way to signal that. I wouldn't jump to say you always need to have like a European style or US style market. There might be some hybrid systems that yet have to be invented. But some kind of price signal of that sort, I find it very hard to imagine doing it without it.
Thank you very, very much. I want to just take 1 second, if you don't mind, and take your photo. Is that okay? Okay. Smile. Smile. Okay, great. Simon, thank you very much. I like your comment that the political elements are often presented in a technical way, and I know that in the current day and age, everybody thinks they're a technical person, and that's very often why we get those confused. And at the end of the day, all technical people are sort of economists, or at least they think they are. And so economists are always, fully engaged in every technical area, and they become, or what they believe, I'm an economist, so I'm speaking poorly about myself, but they believe that they've become the technical expert. And I think therein lies some of the challenges to your very poignant comment there. We'll try to get around that, but I don't think we're ever going to correct that trend. I think that's here to stay. Mr. Hoffman, it is a pleasure to have you here today with us today. I have a question that's going to kind of sum up this particular panel and have us think about some of the things, specific elements of the work we're doing. But in the policy area and in the technical interventions, again, confusing the two, as Simon pointed out, we do often. In the key policy and technical interventions that India would need to integrate 40 gigawatts of solar rooftop, based on your experiences in Germany and other countries, what do you think those key policies and technical interventions are that will help India take this next step? If you had to outline them and say, I don't know, 2, 3, or 4 major areas.
Okay, this is a really technical question, I think, and if that's okay with you, I would like to rephrase a little bit your question to make a more general statement in the end. Is that
Please
okay?
do.
So one first remark, and from the learnings we had in Germany, I think it's very important to figure out the target, or calculate the target figures. Because what we experienced in Germany is that we had to correct the course of the whole transformation a couple of times. And you have to have the courage to really figure out the numbers that you think are the real target. And they are really enormous. But if you do, you can avoid some, let's say, stranded investments that you do otherwise. Yeah? One is that I briefly touched on in my talk is the counter-electric power you need. So before you think about combining heat and power, for example, which takes away counter power from the system, you really have to think about electrifying the cooling sector, the heating sector if necessary, and the mobility. That's, let's say, a technical point. And probably the last point I would like to make about the experiences in Germany is that when we started this whole thing of energy turnover, as I heard the English translation today, or Energiewende as we call it in Germany, it was carried by, the whole movement was carried by enthusiasts. The whole population was very enthusiastic about it, and many people invested, even if it was not a business case. And I think that drove the development even worldwide initially. And then what I presently realize is that this enthusiasm to some point has gone. Why? Because somehow there is a feeling now that, I'm touching on a delicate point here, that the monopolists are taking it all back. Yes, they are trying to win time. We had many, let's say, base democratic movements there where people gathered to afford a wind turbine of 3.6 megawatts, which is not easy for a small community. And now that we changed the legislation, it becomes really difficult for them to go into the risk. So what we calculated was what we call the regional value creation due to renewable energies. And that's a very interesting effect for communities if you somehow arrange the whole legislative system that smaller investors can come into that game. And that's not a technical point, that's a social point. Some, even of the DSOs in our countries say, nowadays, it's not anymore about technical issues, it's not about economical issues, it's about social participation. But what does participation in the end mean? Is it just that you are informed that this high voltage line goes through your backyard, or is it really a financial participation? I firmly believe that is the financial participation, and if you start fresh on it, and all these problems that I here raise, they become apparent only if you're at 10% or 20% energy-wise renewable fraction. Before that, you don't feel it. But then you start to feel it because you have to change infrastructures. And then you have the chance to early on implement it into the system. I think that this transformation is also a great chance for a change towards democracy.
Thank you very much, Clemens. You raised a couple interesting points there. The one that rang true was an early comment, courage to figure out the targets. political will, of course, but sound systems operations and good policymakers, all of them have to be involved in risk management. And of course, at the end of the day, it's the politicians that assume most of the risk, and they're the ones who are going to lead us down the corridors. But the sound technical information that allows them to make those choices based on the understanding of risk is going to be the most poignant winner of the day, hopefully. Hopefully. Because it is somewhat of a risky challenge in moving down this. As those of you that know the technical constraints better than the general population, of course, understand where the risks are and are able to make those choices with that in mind. The general population, the social aspects of these choices, general population doesn't have an understanding of those risks. And all they know is they want 24/7 power, top quality all the time, everywhere, and don't ever let it cut out. And that's of course the challenge, because that part of the largest portion of the population is not willing to live with much of the risk. But it keeps us going, and it keeps us focused on some of those targets.